From the late 80s into the early 90s, Nintendo and Sega found themselves in a heated rivalry. One where they'd fight to take as much control over the gaming marketplace as possible. Sega, trying to find an edge against Nintendo, started tapping into the market of full-motion video games. A market that would boom with releases like Star Wars Rebel Assault, Dracula Unleashed, and Sewer Shark to name a few. But then there would also be another by the name of Night Trap. A game that doesn't seem like much today, but back then made a controversy that would change gaming history forever. Over the years, violent video games have been a hotly debated issue. One that has one side saying that violent video games are making the kids wild, bloodthirsty savages and they should be outright banned.
He will yell out from his room, "Peasant, bring me a plate."
The other side believing that they're nothing more than entertainment. That parents should stop their kids from playing them the same way they would stop their kids from watching a rated R movie. In recent times, we've got to the point where there are headlines and news reports that condemn the evils of video games and how they were destroying the youth of America.
How do you feel about cutting his head off? One.
Instilling panic in the minds of people who become fearful of the violence they see and don't know how to respond to it. Of course, you've got some of the more funny examples like Glenn Beck saying that Watch Dogs is training people to become professional hackers or something like that.
This game is teaching people to hack in to whatever is docked in your bedroom. What the heck is wrong with us? What is wrong with us?
You've likely seen some of these reports by the likes of people like former Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. Somebody who claims that video games are subconsciously conditioning children to be able to, and I quote, pull the trigger the same way cops and soldiers can.
And when I began to become aware of how we teach soldiers and cops how we have to condition them to be able to pull the trigger, to overcome the resistance, we realized that video games doing the same things to the kids.
He's also been seen quoting a study by the American Psychological Association that claims,
less than a year ago, the American Psychological Association made a definitive statement. There is a clear, unequivocal link between violent video games, violent behavior.
It's just too bad that the article they published was one that was later replaced by another that said, there's insufficient scientific evidence to support a causal link between violent video games and violent behavior. And this is also the same guy that gives seminars to police about the idea of killology and promotes people to, quote, enjoy the kill, so make of that what you will. Then you've got Jack Thompson, who I'm sure needs little to no introduction. His saga is definitely one of the most interesting of them all. First known as the lawyer in a fight against rap music, he would later become an activist who would blame games like Doom and Wolfenstein for some very bleak and tragic moments in US history. Needless to say, his claims led him to being one of the most hated people online in the 2000s.
Hi, I'm Jack Thompson. I like to poop my pants.
And having plenty of beef with countless other people. One of my favorite clips of him is where he appears on a G4 panel with Mark Friedler and Adam Sessler to talk about the upcoming game Bully. Thompson, to not much surprise, immediately flies out of the gate with some pretty out there statements. Like how killers were using video games to train themselves, and how the APA established a link between violent video games and aggressive behaviors. Oh dear God.
What you need to do is actually do real research rather than state your position, because it's the American Psychological Association, not Jack Thompson.
There are many reports
a direct causal link.
And man, it is something else seeing Adam Sessler, of all people, completely demolish this man's argument.
It's actually really disturbing and intellectually dishonest and somewhat pernicious to try to say that with all the other ills in the world, you have kids that are getting absolutely poor education in public schools, where they're not getting good medical care given to our healthcare system, and with the fact that people can't seem to get a decent job. Though, what is causing trouble among America's youth in schools? Oh, it has to be a video game. Anyone of thought should find that insulting at the face of it.
So the solution to bad grades is for kids to spend more time playing video games?
Bad
Is that
grades?
your answer?
We are talking about violence. I believe that there are greater reasons for the social ills of adolescent violence than playing a video game, because I believe that violence was existing prior to the release of even Pong.
After that, Thompson did several notable things like sending a cease and desist letter to Midway Games because somebody made a character that looked like him in Mortal Kombat, writing articles with another man by the name of Eugene F. Provenzo, who we'll be talking about later, and suing every retailer under the sun to try and stop the release of Bully. I have an interview with the fantastic Dr. Christopher J. Ferguson, who is co-chair of psychology at Stetson University in Florida, and one of the biggest voices fighting against misconceptions of violent video games, where he talks about some of his interactions with Thompson, and it really gives you a good idea of exactly who it is we're dealing with here.
I occasionally get an email from Jack Thompson. They're not nice emails, but I do get them. So pinhead, I think, is a word that's come up a lot in some of these.
It'd honestly be very easy to make the rest of the video about him, but Anomaly Documentaries already made a great video covering his saga, and I'd highly recommend you go check it out if you want to know more. As you might have noticed, one of the biggest things that a lot of people used in their arguments were these studies or research articles they either conducted or found, showing undeniable proof that there is a direct correlation between violent video games and aggressive behaviors. So I decided to take a look into them. And the upsetting part about all of this is that these articles, well, they're pretty much wrong. On the surface, these articles seem to be pretty legit, showing in detail what their studies were and how they reached their conclusions. But it's just too bad that these studies were made with too small of a sample size, too short of a time frame, no account for the subject, and were conducted by biased researchers. In a study done by Dr. Ferguson, he concluded it would take 27 hours a day of M-rated gameplay to produce clinically noticeable changes in aggression. And man, I know we be gaming, right? But I don't think we be gaming that hard. And not only that, but in another study, also featuring Ferguson, he would go on to find benefits of playing video games. Like how people who played team-based online multiplayer games showed more helpful behaviors and apparently appeared more satisfied with their lives. Dr. Ferguson has done a lot of research onto this matter and has written numerous different papers on the topic, often disproving other studies in those same papers. One of my favorites of his is titled Violent Video Games, Dogma, Fear, and Pseudoscience, where he shows just how wide the gap between the perceived effects of violent video games and reality is. He also talks about some of the research methods used, like popping balloons, rating a person's job performance after being insulted by them, or with annoying bursts of noise.
They give other people bursts of annoying white noise, or put someone's hand in a bucket of ice water when it's freezing cold, or give someone, like hot sauce in a sandwich when they know they don't like spicy food, or things like that, and they're interesting. I mean, these are like, I try to point out that they're interesting. I do this research too, you know what I mean? So I'm not trying to toss the baby out with the bathwater here necessarily, but it's like prank level aggression. We're talking about the people who on April Fool's Day put the rubber band around that hose gun thing that's on the sink, right? So it's aimed at you when you turn on the sink. It's that level of aggression. It's not the gangs of Chicago aren't running around with wasabi sauce,
And probably the most cited study was this one conducted by Craig Anderson and Karen Dill. The same one that Grossman and Thompson used as their evidence straight from the APA. On the surface, it looks like there was a lot done here, and it seems like they might actually be onto something. Unfortunately, once you start digging a little deeper, it all starts to come apart. The main problem being how Anderson and Dill use 4 separate aggression measures here, and only get a barely noticeable result out of one of them, but decided to run with it anyway. Looking at other examples, it wasn't uncommon for some researchers to use some unstandardized measures to get their findings. And when that wasn't enough, they cherry-picked the ones that best suited their hypothesis. He even notes how all these researchers failed to comment on the fact that while these violent video games were climbing in popularity, the United States had actually seen the lowest violent crime rate in youth since the 1960s. And to top it all off, whenever they found the slightest inkling of aggression, and we're talking very broadly here. It was like a 4% change at most. In truth, the only thing video games were guilty of was existing. So, like how rock music was demonized and TV rotted your brain, video games became the latest punching bag for people to try and swing at. But how is it that we even got to this point in the first place? How is it that things got this bad? Well, considering that video games in their formative years were just people playing with 2 sticks and a ball, it took a while before parents moved on from looking at it like, that's neat. But probably the first time video games were put under any major mainstream scrutiny went all the way back to 1976 with the popular arcade game Death Race. This game had you driving around, running over pedestrians that would pretty loudly scream and then turn into tombstones after being hit. The game was actually more or less a repurposed version of another arcade game titled Destruction Derby that was never really meant to cause as much of a stir as it did. Nonetheless, it would eventually get an article written about it by the Associated Press and, pretty infamously, had a 60 Minutes report on it that same year. A report that seemingly condemned it for allowing people to partake in, quote, synthetic killing. I mean, there is that one delivery guy in here that I think just wants to run people over, but that's beside the point. Probably the best thing about this report is the defense of the pedestrians you're running over actually just being gremlins, so it's no big deal. The next time I found any popular discussion of video games making people more violent went back to 1982. You know, only the same year when E.T. the extraterrestrial damn near crashed the whole gaming industry. This is when Dr. C. Everett Koop, a pediatric surgeon, public health administrator, and Surgeon General of the United States, would voice his concern about video games. After his speech about family violence, he would say that he felt they might be hazardous to the health of young people, and that kids were becoming addicted to the machines. And with a claim like that, it leads one to wonder what game he could possibly be talking about that could be so detrimental to the well-being of children. So I want to see what kind of game comes to mind when you see claims like that. Bro, he was talking about Pac-Man. When word of this spread and people rightfully criticized these claims, Koop would back down from his statement saying it was a purely personal judgment and not based on any accumulated scientific evidence. It was just his opinion in a discussion about family violence. Glenn Braswell, who was the executive director of the Amusement Game Manufacturers Association, pretty much said, "Bro, as the spokesperson of public health, don't you think you should do some research?" And while many people felt that Koop was in the wrong, instances like these would be the ones to plant the seeds for what would come next. With all the misunderstandings and misconceptions around video games growing, and people becoming more and more fearful of them, it was only a matter of time before things eventually reached a boiling point. Enter Night Trap, a game that was met with decent to mediocre reviews, fair sales, and would otherwise be forgotten to time if it wasn't for one simple thing: the violence. It quickly began to create concern in the United States, with parents nationwide worrying about the idea of their kids picking the game up and becoming violent themselves. And all this worry would result in the 1993 Senate hearings on violent video games, which, if I'm being honest, is just not great. This would be the hearing where several different lawmakers and Judiciary Committee members would go on to discuss the matter of violent video games and their perceived impact on children. The hearing was led by Senator Joseph Lieberman, a person who had previously voiced his disdain for violent video games and went on record to say that he would outright ban them if it were up to him.
Like the Grinch who stole Christmas, these violent video games threaten to rob this particular holiday season of a spirit of goodwill.
Get out! Get out! Get that!
Just a little overdramatic, aren't we? Oh, and don't you worry, he wasn't the only one with a bias against them. As a matter of fact, it felt like the overwhelming majority of people present at the hearing were ready to ban the sale of mature video games overall. But thankfully, there was some logic going on here, with the primary idea being to establish a game's rating board to keep all the violence and sex out of video games.
The real challenge comes when we begin to determine what our community standards are. My own independence, the legacy and heritage of the American characters, determines that I don't wish anyone, even members of this committee or any other body, to dictate to me what I believe to be appropriate for my daughters to see, or to say, or to do, any more than I would presume to tell you what is appropriate for your sons and daughters. What is fitting, however, and I hope we can share, is a commitment to providing parents with appropriate tools to make reasonable judgments for our children.
Senator Hubert Cole even brings up another game called Lethal Enforcers, which he uses as an example of a game promoting guns as a solution to your problems. The most damning part? The added gun controller they bundled in called the Justifier. The game itself is just you playing as an officer ridding the streets of a major crime organization. The issue is that, while I think we can all agree that the gun is a little over the top, this game was never intended for children.
Make no mistake about it, Lethal Enforcers is aimed at young kids.
As a matter of fact, this is one of the very first games that Sega rated MA17 by its Video Game Rating Council, with the explicit intent to avoid this controversy. You see, as parents grew increasingly uneasy with violent video games, Sega felt they needed to do something to nip this issue in the bud. So they established the Video Game Rating Council, or the VRC for short. Then they rated every game for their specific audiences and put it on the front of the box. Admittedly though, the VRC wasn't the best solution, mainly because it was self-regulated. Meaning that if they wanted to dance around the content of a game to lower its rating and put it into more people's hands, they could do that. And that's precisely what they did with Mortal Kombat. Instead of rating this game MA17, they decided to censor it and make it an MA13 game. But all you had to do was plug in the blood code that you got from your cheat code book at the book fair and boom! Decisions like these are probably part of the reason why other companies like Nintendo decided they don't want to join the VRC. And let's not forget that Nintendo and Sega were mixed in the Great Gaming War at the time. So any partnership or collaboration between the two was out the window. It's just outside the realm of possibility. Not to mention, Nintendo just be petty like that. Getting back on track, the hearing would then shift focus to Night Trap. Night Trap was especially controversial thanks to it being an interactive movie game, meaning you got to see people act out violence. Oh no, what a crazy idea. Which is really funny because this is one of the goofiest ass B-horror games I have ever seen.
And I said earlier that I thought that violence was gratuitous and offensive and ought not to be available to people in our society.
The main debacle being many in the hearing feeling as though the game was actively promoting violence against women.
It is a sick, disgusting video game in my judgment. It's an effort to trap and kill women. Shame on people that produce that trash. It's child abuse in my judgment.
I know many of you are probably unfamiliar with Night Trap and exactly what it is. So when you hear this guy say that it's an active effort to trap and kill women, you probably think,
must be bad.
But that's just not what the game is. So, to avoid any further confusion, let's play the context. When playing Night Trap, you watch a group of girls sleeping over at a house filled with traps and cameras by vampires known as augurs, something like that. It is your job as an agent of the Sega Control Attack Team, or SCAT, to control the cameras and traps to protect the girls at the sleepover. So we're already off to a bad start here with Senator Dorgan's argument being, wrong! It's pretty easy to tell that his entire argument comes from personal bias when, ideally, he should be looking at this impartially. His position just doesn't really make for a compelling argument. And this would not be the only time he'd do this, but more on that later. While Sega might have been the main company under the microscope here, Nintendo, more specifically Howard Lincoln, a former chairman of Nintendo of America, was also present. And man, it's just funny to me seeing Nintendo doing their usual slimy practices as far back as this. And what I mean by that is while the gaming industry was burning down in this hearing, Lincoln decided to save face instead of presenting a case to help the entire industry. He presented Nintendo as a model gaming company that others should follow, patting themselves on the back for censoring Mortal Kombat despite knowing it would drop sales, or even this now infamous quote of Lincoln saying,
"And let me say that for the record, I want to state that Night Trap will never appear on a Nintendo system."
Ass kissing aside, it's a really shallow and harmful position to take because it was only presenting one option for the video games industry in the United States. You either make kiddie games like Nintendo's, or you don't make games at all, since they would be the role model for other companies to follow. Many of us recognize Nintendo as being a family-friendly company with childhood favorites like Mario, Donkey Kong, and Kirby, to name a few. And back then, that image of being the go-to gaming company for kids was absolutely everything to them. Their largest demographic since they had saved the gaming industry from crashing was kids. It was a no-brainer to cater specifically to that market. So they kept that image of themselves that many people still hold with the company today. But the thing that bothers me so much though, is that their borderline obsession with this family-friendly image is just so disingenuous. And let me tell you why. The goal of any company, big or small, first and foremost, is to make money hand over fist. I am sorry to tell you, but it's not about the games, it's not about the fans. The artistry of it comes second. It's all about that bread. And when they see money in the content of Bayonetta's cleavage, they will start selling that content. Don't believe me? Look what's happened since then. Video games like Call of Duty, which had its own set of controversies, would find their way onto Nintendo consoles. Games like Bayonetta are now Nintendo staples. Night Trap was released on the Switch. Hell, you can even go back to see that Lethal Enforcers was released on the SNES. So instead of helping the gaming industry, they helped themselves. And it was just sad. It's like Nintendo saw this as an opportunity to sink their opponents without realizing that they were next in line to drown. Sega's whole MO of "we do what Nintendo don't" likely prompted the sale of games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap on Sega consoles in the first place. But they failed to recognize that they too were very much in hot water.
It's called the Super Scope. The gun that you have in your hand is called the Justifier. I think that this game is a target shoot. This device is for target shooting and whatnot. You know, I guess I'd rest my case with the fact that we're not putting the name Justifier on it.
And no matter what the name is on it, putting it in the hands of a kid just gives them the wrong idea. As I must say, to me that looks like a weapon, and not like a high-tech implement of any kind. It looks like an assault weapon of some kind.
This was not the time to be squabbling, but Nintendo chose to anyway. And while the people there were certainly more approving of Nintendo's library and regulations, it didn't mean that it got them any leeway from those same people. Meanwhile, Bill White, who was the vice president of Sega of America at the time, and a former Nintendo employee, actually makes some sensible points regarding the whole issue. Saying things like, "Hey, I don't know if you're aware, but we make games for both kids and adults." Not to mention, he also shows data that the average Sega CD user is about 22 years old, and that only 5% of the user base is under the age of 13. Also that the older Genesis had an average user age of around 19 years old, and has less than 30% under the age of 13 using the console. He then breaks down Sega's software revenue split by genre to show off just how unlikely it was that a child would play Night Trap in the first place. This is to say that children were just one of many demographics for video games. And this is something that the people at the hearing were not only ignorant of, but then proceeded to blow off.
Until the research is done, we feel it's an appropriate step to develop an industry-wide rating system which has enforcement that will allow adults, which represent 60% of the players for the Sega CD system, to make the choice as to whether or not that game is right or wrong for them.
Let me talk to you about the rating system. I understand your argument. I disagree with it, that you have a broad market and it includes adults as well as kids.
And continue talking about them like they were toys. It's honestly upsetting to watch all these people ignore White's points simply because many of them were too antiquated with their ideals of entertainment. Not even hearing him when he makes a point of information, not regulation, being the appropriate way to tackle this problem.
As you can see, evolving interactive technology has spawned a huge market that goes well beyond the child-oriented directed titles that gave the industry its start. Clearly, whatever Congress might do would affect a large, diverse group of consumers, young and old, in a volatile industry only in its infancy. Information, not regulation, is the appropriate policy.
Maybe guiding children instead of pretending these things don't exist is the best way to approach this. And then, I'm shocked that we needed to do this at all, but White would go on to break down the VRC ratings and describe them as being similar to the MPAA system for movies. In the same way your kid couldn't walk into a Blockbuster and rent a copy of Come and See on DVD, your kid wouldn't be able to get an MA-17 title. But Lieberman seemingly finds any sort of depicted violence abhorrent. So he's like, why do you feel like this would even be appropriate for adults? I mean, it's just so vile. Well, White definitely knows what's going on here and calls his bluff, stating that if you were to decontextualize graphic scenes in all sorts of movies and other media, like they did with Night Trap, they'd probably conclude that those were inappropriate too. Worst of all, it's not like you get these violent cutscenes from just playing the game. This is what happens if you suck at the game. In other words, if you lose. If you're playing the game correctly, you're saving everybody in this game.
All right, you were perfect. Nobody's ever done that. I knew I could count on you. Thanks. You are wonderful.
And just to add to the embarrassment, some dude in the crowd has the gall to ask,
If you're a bad player, what happens? If you're a bad player, what happens?
Dear Lord God, make it end. And while I'm glad that White brings some semblance of reason to this hearing, it unfortunately goes downhill from here. Sega is caught in 4K when the room is shown a pretty predatory ad campaign making it seem like you're a loser if you don't own games like Mortal Kombat. White then also tries to say that Nintendo has some pretty violent video games too. And to back that statement up, shows gameplay of Street Fighter 2. Like, bro, you had something solid going on with a demographics argument. Let's not completely undermine the entirety of that by being like, okay, maybe our games are violent, but Nintendo's doing it too! And just when things are at their lowest, Senator Dorgan, having probably put his fingers in his ears for the last several minutes, returns to discuss why he thinks the sale of violent video games is a detriment to children. Oh, did I say discuss? Because what I meant to say was belittle White and throw out even more misinformation. He was in the right saying Night Trap was not initially rated, since Sega hadn't established the VRC yet, but then he states that he thought the game received an MA-13 rating. White shuts this down and goes, no, it was rated MA-17. And then I think it's at this point Dorgan is just completely lost. He was really banking on the, well, how is this appropriate for kids argument that literally everybody else brought up. Seemingly lost as to where to go next, he finds another out and goes, what's going on with that MA-13 rating, huh, buddy boy? Are you really trying to tell me that kids over 13 are mature?
And do you view those over the age of 13 as mature?
There's 3 designations that the Independent Rating Council chooses to designate the product. It's MA-13, appropriate for teenagers and older. but not for young children with parental.
But doesn't
guidance
have the word mature attached to that?
Yes, I believe it does.
Which is just a moot point because the game isn't rated MA-13, but White still indulges him and, unfortunately, has to explain to Dorgan that it's practically the same thing as a PG-13 rating. It's just an admittedly stupid name. In the same way a PG-13 movie suggests parental guidance, so does an MA-13 rating. Not like any of this matters in the first place, though. Dorgan then turns this conversation around again to say that this whole thing is about having the, quote, responsibility to protect children. This is the entire platform that Dorgan has been building himself up on. Even earlier, throwing out statistics about roughly 1 million children being born out of wedlock, and how it is that those children could ever receive that parental guidance. And you know what? I applaud that he concerns himself with such a small demographic of kids that not a lot of people think about. Ultimately, I agree that protecting children should be the main priority. However, your methods serve absolutely nobody except for those who don't engage with video games in the first place. I firmly believe in White's earlier words that information, not regulation, is the right way to go. And speaking of information, let's break down Dorgan's argument even further. His concern about the 1 million children being born out of wedlock being victims of violent video games is such a weak argument for banning these games. And let me explain why. Let's look at the worst case scenario. Considering rough estimates of how many children there are in the United States, there should have been something like 50 million children in the 90s, give or take. When we take that 1 million number and find the percentage of children that could be affected, we see that it is only 2%. And considering that Night Trap sold roughly 400,000 copies by the time we got to 1998, so I'm being extremely generous here, we come up with an alarming 0.8% of children who could have actually played this game. And we all know that 0.8% is impossible. Hell, I'd be shocked if it was over 0.1%. It is statistically more realistic that their dad was like, hey Jimmy, come check this shit out. And that's why it bothers me so much when Dorgan decides to call White out and says that he thinks White doesn't even know what the case is actually about.
You know, I read your statement, and I honestly think that you don't understand what we're talking about here. Let me tell you why.
When all Dorgan has done is run circles around the problem and, frankly, make an ass out of himself. It's pretty evident that nobody at this hearing took their time to do any research. They all walked in here like, well, this is the way I feel, so that's gotta be right, and stood by the same two arguments. And just when you thought that things couldn't get worse, we get Professor Eugene Provenzo's presentation, which is just wild. So strap in, friends, because we're going to be here for a minute. His argument is not based on scientific research or analysis, but rather a hypothetical. He believes that the central cause for violence and aggression around the world is TV.
Holy moly.
Yes, TV. It's funny to me because he states that there are other issues like, I don't know, alcohol, stress, and poverty that could be a culprit, but he just brushes those off because TV is the real problem here. I've already talked about some of the issues that TV has, right? But it's not the medium itself that's at fault here. The problem is with the people on TV that have no idea what they're talking about, but speak like they do. Kinda like what he does here. He says he looked at the 47 most popular games in the United States and found that 40 of the 47 had violence as their quote-unquote main theme. 13 of which included scenarios where women were kidnapped and rescued.
That's cap! Totally can't. That means lie.
I don't think you need me to tell you just how incredibly drastic and misleading that information is. By his definition of violence, Mario is the evilest game series known to mankind. I will admit there was definitely a problem with female representation in the past. There might have been a few good outliers here and there, but the bad definitely outweighed the good. Luckily, female representation has gotten a lot better over time, and seems to be continuing towards that direction. He then goes on a rant about the evils of TV and the studies that need to be done, which I think incidentally outed his findings as being based on no scientific evidence, and how we need to redo all the classic television studies. So, in other words, he wants to redo them because the results don't match what he's saying, and he doesn't like that very much. He also apparently interviewed children about lethal enforcers and said that the kids would associate the Japanese, and I had to change that word because he described that group of people with a slur, and the Chinese as being extremely violent. Now, I'm not saying that a man with an extreme distaste for violent media would ever possibly exaggerate his findings, even less that he'd maybe lead the children towards the answer he wants them to give, but considering the validity of his last findings, I wouldn't be surprised. What does surprise me though, is that he then says that he believes, but cannot prove, that homophobia is present in how the women are portrayed in video games.
Well, there is depictions, I believe, although it's hard to prove, but my perception of homophobia operating in terms of how certain types of women are portrayed.
These nightmares have given me a mean headache.
I'm trying so desperately to wrap my head around what the hell he could possibly mean by that.
They're subtle and they're hard to get at sometimes, but I think they present a rather disturbing world.
Ah, yes. My favorite code for I don't have any examples. And just when you think that things couldn't get worse, despite everything he has just said, he finishes by saying that he wants the violence in media to be portrayed more accurately.
I'd like to see violence portrayed accurately. I would like to see in television violence, when someone is shot in the leg, someone isn't winged, but what really happens to them. I would like to see in a video game that if you punch someone viciously, they don't get up and walk away immediately and take another punch. I spend a lot of time out in the field interviewing kids, and they don't understand what guns and hitting does. And I think they need to understand that, and they don't get that communicated to them through either television or video games at all. They think that guns aren't that serious. They don't understand that guns kill people, or that when a gun goes through your leg, you may not walk again, or you may lose your leg, because your leg may explode. They don't understand any of that.
And then he's got this whole rant about cyber sex, and I don't even want to get into that one. That one's just weird. Marilyn Droz has a somewhat similar stance to Provenzo, but accidentally ends up making an interesting point that kind of undermines her argument. Her argument stems from how quickly technology is advancing, how it's snowballing so much that it's going to reach a point where this generation of people won't be able to understand it anymore.
The toys that we have now, the technology that we are getting through the video games is phenomenal. And certainly can have the power to prepare our children for a future that we are not even able to understand ourselves, and a future that's well worth looking forward to.
And considering everything we have witnessed up to that point, it was pretty evident that they had already gotten there. As mentioned before, it's clear that many people here are just not in the know about what's going on and didn't even try to understand what they were talking about. You can see this in how they never seem to acknowledge any demographic aside from children, how they regularly refer to these games as toys, and the visible disinterest and disrespect when people like Bill White present their case. Which, simply put, was an astonishingly unfair way to conduct this hearing. That said, I don't like using this platform to just tear people down and belittle them because there's just nothing to be gained from that, and it's not something I like to do. So I'd be remiss if I didn't say that while I think the hearing wasn't great, I feel like a lot of people here were only doing what they felt was right. It's important to remember that a lot of these people aren't here just because they hate video games for the sake of hating video games. No, a lot of them were worried about the possibility of these games making kids more violent, and therefore wanted to safeguard them from that. And when they speak, it sounds like I'm listening to a parent worried about their kids.
I was moved by your statement, which is one that parents must all feel, which is they wouldn't want their daughters going out with a boy who had just been playing one of these video games. Part of the outrage here and the anger and the frustration, of course, is just what you testified to, which is that parents increasingly feel that they're losing the battle for their children to other forces in our society.
There were times when people like Dorgan and Lieberman expressed some very genuine concerns and were actually fair in their arguments and criticisms of the video games industry.
Prior to this hearing, I've seen very little effort on the part of people in the industry to do that. The effort has been to try to follow the money tracks and see how you can profit.
And let me be clear that while I've been defending Sega a good bit here, they were definitely no angels either. They showed through their predatory ad campaigns and their bypassing of their own rating systems that they too were very much part of the problem. After this hearing, there was a second where not much of note happened, but did result in a surprising conclusion considering how the first one went. Thankfully, it was decided that banning violent video games would break the First Amendment and be considered censorship. Even Lieberman, who says he wanted to outright ban them, was more concerned with upholding the Constitution than banning these games. This discussion would lead to the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or the ESRB as many of us recognize it. At first, Sega wanted to use the foundation of the VRC to build the ESRB up. But Nintendo rolled up with their big boy pants on and outright refused to do anything Sega was proposing. But eventually, things finally came together to make the rating system that practically every gaming company banded under. Following the 1993 hearing, sales for Night Trap suddenly went through the roof. It turns out that instead of keeping it out of the hands of children, the hearing hit it with the good old Joker effect, and likely got it onto more kids' radars. Upsettingly though, all the growing controversy and uproar from the parents led Sega to cave in and take the game off store shelves until they could censor it and later re-release it. So, needless to say, while these games wouldn't be banned, that wouldn't stop people from trying to get rid of them. One prime example being a game by the name of Phantasmagoria, an FMV game that was being marketed as having Hollywood-level special effects, having countless different backgrounds made for it, and being designed by the beloved Roberta Williams, who, if you don't know, had a major impact on gaming as is. And this game faced a lot of issues. In particular, certain retailers refused to stock it in due part to its violence. And eventually, when more and more of these types of games came out and they weren't regulated, the states decided that if the government wouldn't regulate it, they would. Particularly, California in 2005. This would begin when California State Senator Leland Yee, a former child psychologist, believed there was a link between aggressive behaviors and violent oh god, not again. And because of that, he proposed a bill banning the sale of violent video games to minors. The bill was then signed into law by the kindergarten cop himself, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who is most widely recognized as the action star of high-octane action movies, but that's neither here nor there. And as soon as the Entertainment Merchants Association caught wind of this, they were not happy. They feared that California would pull a proviso and stretch the meaning of what a violent video game was, and, in turn, circumvent the system that was already in play, the ESRB. The EMA had already taken multiple other states to court and won their cases. Still, California's case, otherwise known as Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association, would be the most important one. And let me quickly pause here because I don't have footage of this case like I did with the 1993 one, but I did find a video where somebody took the audio from it and overlaid it on top of footage of dogs in a courtroom, so I'll be using that instead. The EMA would end up winning the case when it was ruled that the Californian law infringed on the First Amendment and that there was insufficient evidence to prove the claims that Yee suggested. And even adding on to that, the court felt minors should have the right of the First Amendment. This was a major victory for the video games industry, since many were iffy about the idea of video games being protected under freedom of speech. And while there was some more back and forth, Arnie was apparently adamant about keeping this law in place. The result was the same, and video games remained constitutionally protected, leaving it up to parents to decide what their kids should or shouldn't play. Since then, things have become a lot better with people looking into the other factors influencing violent behaviors, with the primary among them being mental health. Still, that doesn't mean we haven't seen our fair share of people blaming video games for violence, still using it as a scapegoat for more pressing underlying issues that deserve more attention. Which is pretty ironic considering how many of these people crusading against these games would turn out. Dave Grossman's Killology seminars are being scrutinized for teaching that killing is not that big a deal, and telling officers that the night of their first kill, they'll have the best sex of their lives. Jack Thompson would be permanently disbarred after his escapades, including, but not limited to, him trying to sue the Florida bar, and even Leland Yee would be arrested after it was discovered that he purchased nearly $2 million worth of automatic firearms and rocket launchers from a terrorist group. It turned out that a lot of the people advocating against violent video games ended up doing more damage than any violent video game ever could. Further research even found that many of the people that caused these violent events had never even so much as played a video game and just used them to avoid accountability. That said, I think it's important to say that many of the people taking a stance against violent video games were not doing so out of malice. There was a clear panic rising, and parents wanted to protect their children from a world they were gradually understanding less and less. Not to mention those that were already affected by tragedy and wanted justice but didn't know how else to get it. So when they saw people on TV blaming a medium they maybe didn't understand, they were ready and willing to fight against it. And while video games might not be under the microscope like they used to be, it's likely that whatever the next big thing is will come under attack just like they did. So aside from just how interesting I think all of this is, I think it's also important to remember this saga going into the future. Remember how people were misinformed and then used by others to elevate themselves off of their panic. And remember how important it is to look at the other issues going on that we've maybe not been paying enough attention to. And with that, that was the violent video game controversy. Hello everybody, and thank you so much for watching this video. It's definitely a different turn from what I'm used to doing, so hopefully you enjoyed it, hopefully you think it worked. I honestly just wanted to come on here and thank you guys because it's been a minute since I last talked into this camera that I still hate looking into. But I know there's been a lot of changes going on around here, and I appreciate you guys that have been sticking around. The channel's been growing more and more thanks to the Chainsaw Man video and the Gamera video, so to all of you that are new here, thank you so much for checking me out and sticking around. My lizard is eating right now. I don't know if you can hear that. But also to tell you guys that you're going to see some new things on the channel, some stuff like this, some things that you maybe haven't seen before alongside the old content. You'll hear all about it in the members tab if you are a channel member. It's shill time, baby. That's right. If you are a channel member, you could have seen this video about 2 weeks early. There's also going to be some exclusive content on there, like my interview with Dr. Ferguson, who I have to say I was not expecting to actually go with this interview or anything. I reached out to him and I thought, no chance. But he was very nice. He was very kind. He took all my questions despite my interview being terrible. And I promised him I'd shout out his new book, which I'll leave a link to in the description. Please go and check that out. Seriously, such an awesome guy. If you're watching this, Dr. Ferguson, Chris, thank you so much.
Oh yeah, I've always got like, you know, books, merch. You know, we don't. No, I don't have any merch. It's not like a Chris Ferguson T-shirt. No, I have a book that just came out this year. It's called Catastrophe: The Psychology of Why Good People Make Bad Situations Worse. That's a new book I've got out. I've got an old book on video games, Moral Combat: Why the War on Violent Video Games is Wrong. People can visit me on my website, which is just my name, so it's www.jferguson.com, and people can follow me on Twitter, cjferguson1111. And yeah, definitely buy some books. Help me put my kid through college, you know, and awesome. No, I appreciate it.
Absolutely, and thank you for showing up. But per usual, I'd love to hear what you guys think about this video, especially since it's something pretty different. I don't know how it turned out, really. I feel like I did a good job. Maybe I didn't. I don't know. Who knows? I don't know. Also, shout outs to my second channel real quick because I've been uploading a little bit more over there. If you like, I don't know, tier lists or that crap, check it out. I don't know. I'll probably be doing some more stuff on there. It'll be fun, maybe, hopefully, possibly. But again, just thank you guys so much for stopping by, checking it out, sticking around. I really appreciate it. All the support on the channel recently has been amazing. But yeah, I'll see you guys later. Again, thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.